The morning Hester Townsend was told she would wear the pale blue dress with the high lace collar and the 12 buttons running up the back like a spine of tiny ivory bones. Something inside her went very quiet, very still, and very certain that she would do no such thing. It was the spring of 1883, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of everything that was tame and everything that was not. The Kishom Trail ran like a scar through the land just west of town, and Cattle Drive still kicked up dust clouds that could be seen for miles when the wind blew right. Caldwell was not a gentle place. It was a place that smelled of horse leather and ambition, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from standing at the very hem of the frontier and wondering what lies beyond the stitching. It was not the kind of place where a woman was expected to have opinions about her own clothing, her own future, or much else at all. Hester had opinions about everything. She was 23 years old, brown-haired and brown-eyed, with hands that were slightly rougher than her mother had ever approved of, and a way of looking at people that made them feel like they were being measured for something they hadn't agreed to be measured for. She had grown up in Caldwell, the daughter of William Townsend, who ran the mercantile, and Margaret Townsend, who had devoted her entire energetic existence to ensuring that Hester would marry well, marry soon, and cause her as few additional gray hairs as humanly possible. The pale blue dress had been purchased from a catalog out of St. Louis, which meant it had cost William Townsend considerably more than a dress had any right to cost, and it had arrived 2 weeks ago wrapped in brown paper and string, and Margaret Townsend had held it up against the light coming through the mercantile's front window and declared it absolutely perfect. It was not perfect. It was stiff at the shoulders and narrow at the hips, and the high collar sat like a hand pressed flat against the throat. Hester had tried it on in her bedroom on the second floor of the Townsend house, standing before the small mirror that hung above her wash basin, and she had looked at herself for a long moment and felt like a woman wearing a costume designed by someone who had never actually met her. The dress had been purchased for a specific occasion. In 3 weeks' time, there was to be a spring social at the Cattlemen's Association Hall on Main Street, which was the largest gathering Caldwell hosted that did not involve cattle. Every unmarried woman of appropriate age and background would be there in her finest, and every man of means and ambition would be there evaluating his options, and Margaret Townsend had decided, firmly and absolutely, that this was the occasion on which Hester would be introduced to Mr. Dorian Hale. Dorian Hale was 37 years old and owned the largest ranch in the surrounding county, a spread of 3,000 acres south of town called the Crooked H. He was a widower with 2 children, a man of known wealth and unknown temperament, and he had let it be known through various social channels that he was in the market for a second wife. He was not unpleasant looking. He had fair hair and pale eyes and a careful quality to his smile that suggested he had learned long ago to be charming when charm was useful, and to be something else entirely when it was not. Margaret Townsend thought he was the answer to all her prayers. Hester thought he looked at women like he was appraising livestock at the county fair. But none of this was why she refused the dress on that particular morning. She refused it because she had gotten up early, before her mother was awake, and gone down to the mercantile to help her father open up and restock shelves, which was something she did most mornings because she liked the quiet of the early hour, and because working with her hands made her feel like herself in a way that sitting in the parlor with embroidery never did. And while she was pulling bolts of cotton fabric from a crate and stacking them on the shelf, she had found, at the bottom of the same crate, a length of deep red fabric, the color of autumn leaves just before they fall, thick and soft and shot through with a faint texture that caught the light when she turned it in her hands. She had stood there holding it for a very long time. She was not a seamstress exactly, but she had enough skill with a needle to know what she could do, and what she could see, very clearly, was a dress. Not the pale blue cage her mother had ordered from St. Louis, but something else entirely. A dress with room to move in it, with a skirt that fell in a clean line rather than a bell, with sleeves rolled to the elbow if she wanted them that way, with a neckline that was respectable but not strangling. A dress that looked like her. She bought the fabric from her father's own stock at cost, which was within her rights since she helped run the place, and she carried it upstairs to her room and she began. Her mother found out by noon. "You cannot wear homemade to the spring social," Margaret said, standing in the doorway of Hester's room with her arms crossed over her chest and her voice at the particular pitch that meant she was doing everything in her power not to shout. "Dorian Hale will be there." "Do you understand who Dorian Hale is, Hester?" "A man with 3,000 acres and something behind his eyes that I don't trust," Hester said, not looking up from her work. "He is the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties. He's 37 and he's already worn out one wife. Eleanor Hale died of fever. That is not a reflection on Dorian's character." "I didn't say it was." Hester set down her needle and looked at her mother directly, which was something she had learned was the only way to be heard in this house. "Mama, I will go to the social. I will be pleasant to Mr. Hale. I will dance with him if he asks me. But I will wear what I choose to wear, and I will not wear that dress." The argument that followed lasted the better part of 2 hours, involved William Townsend being called upstairs to mediate and retreating in defeat after approximately 8 minutes, and ended with Margaret Townsend sweeping out of the room in a storm of injured dignity and Hester returning to her sewing with the focused calm of someone who had already made up her mind and was merely waiting for the world to catch up. The dress took her 11 days. It was not quite right at first. The side seams needed taking in and then letting out again because she'd miscalculated, and the sleeve hem on the left side sat lower than on the right for reasons she couldn't entirely explain. But by the time she had it finished, with a narrow belt she'd cut from a strip of leather her father kept in the back room, the dress was exactly what she'd seen in her mind when she first held the fabric. Deep red, simple-lined, nothing to apologize for. She hung it on the peg behind her bedroom door and felt something open in her chest like a window. She did not know at that moment that 3 days before the spring social, a man named Seth Carver would ride into Caldwell with 40 head of longhorn cattle, a 6-month trail contract from a ranch up in Colorado, and a set of values about women's choices that had been shaped by a mother who had died too young, but had, in the time she lived, refused almost every constraint placed upon her with remarkable good grace. Seth Carver was 28 years old, which put him squarely in the range of men who had worked long enough to know what they were doing and not long enough to have gotten bitter about it. He was tall and lean in the way that years of hard riding shaped a man, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were a particularly clear shade of gray that seemed, in certain lights, to hold the entire open sky. He had grown up in Texas, the son of a horse breeder, and had drifted north following the work when the ranch his father had built went under in the drought of '78. He did not have property. He did not have a permanent address. What he had was a reputation among cattle brokers and ranch owners for being absolutely reliable, completely honest, and nearly impossible to panic in a crisis, which were qualities worth considerably more than property in certain circles. He delivered his 40 head to the stockyards at the north end of Caldwell's Main Street on a Wednesday afternoon, collected his payment from the broker there, a stout man named Griggs with ink-stained fingers, and then did the thing he always did at the end of a drive. He found the nearest establishment where a bath could be arranged, spent 45 minutes in it, changed into the second set of clothes he kept rolled in his saddlebag for exactly this purpose, and felt himself return to something like a human being. He was walking down Main Street toward the hotel when he passed the Townsend Mercantile, and the door opened outward almost directly into his path, and a woman came out carrying a bolt of interfacing fabric and a spool of thread and a small paper bag of buttons, and she was not watching where she was going because she was reading a folded piece of paper in her free hand, which he later learned was a note from her friend Clara about the arrangements for the social. And he stepped back just quickly enough that she didn't walk fully into him. But the bolt of interfacing caught him across the left arm, and she looked up. "I beg your pardon," she said immediately, in the tone of someone who genuinely meant it but was also still partially elsewhere. "I wasn't watching." "No harm done," Seth said, and he meant that too, because the interfacing was soft and the whole thing had been fairly graceful by the standards of accidental Main Street collisions. She looked at him for a moment. He looked at her. There was nothing particularly remarkable about this moment, except that it was the first time, and those always matter. "Are you just passing through?" she asked, in the direct way she had, which he would later learn was characteristic of her, and which he found immediately interesting. "Just finished a drive," he said, "staying a few days before I head back to Colorado." "Passing through then," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not unfriendly, just precise. "More or less," he said. She adjusted the bolt of fabric under her arm, and he noticed the deep red color of it, and that it matched something in the way she carried herself, if a color can match a person. She said good afternoon, and went back through the door into the Mercantile. And Seth stood on the boardwalk for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, before he continued down the street. He asked about her at the hotel because he was who he was, which was a man who preferred to know things honestly rather than wonder about them. The hotel keeper, a talkative man named Birch, told him her name was Hester Townsend, and that her father owned the Mercantile, and that her mother had been trying to marry her off to Dorian Hale, which was common knowledge in Caldwell, and that there was a social on Saturday that the whole town went to. "You're welcome to come," Birch said, with the generosity of a man who had nothing personally at stake. "It's open. The Cattlemen's Hall starts at 7. Seth Carver thanked him and went upstairs and sat on the edge of the hotel bed, and thought about clear brown eyes and red fabric, and the particular quality of a person who looks at you like they are actually seeing you. And he decided he would attend the social on Saturday, which was not something he usually did. Thursday and Friday passed in the ordinary way of small frontier towns, which meant there was always something happening if you paid attention, and nothing particularly dramatic if you didn't. Seth spent part of Thursday helping the stockyard hands fix a section of fence that had come down overnight, which he did because the work was there, and he was physically incapable of watching something broken when he had the means to fix it. He spent part of Friday at the livery where his horse, a dark bay named August, was being reshod, and he talked to the farrier and to 2 other drovers who had come in with a smaller herd from the south, and the afternoon stretched out the way afternoons do when you are in between one thing and the next. He saw Hester Townsend on Friday afternoon. She was crossing the street toward the post office, and she saw him at the same moment, and she gave a brief nod that was the frontier equivalent of a formal greeting, and he returned it, and that was the entirety of it, but it was enough to make something in his chest feel less provisional than usual. Saturday came with clear skies and the kind of warmth that happens in Kansas in late April when the season has finally decided to commit itself. And Hester Townsend stood in her bedroom at 6 o'clock in the evening and put on the red dress she had made with her own hands. Her mother had not spoken to her about the dress for the past 2 days, which Hester understood to be a form of protest, and her father had said, very quietly and privately, that he thought it was a fine piece of work. She did the buttons herself, the 12 of them running up the back, which was easier than the 12 on the pale blue St. Louis dress because these were her own buttons, the ones she had chosen, and they felt right in her hands. She braided her hair and coiled it at the base of her neck and put in 2 horn combs her grandmother had left her, and she looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin, and this time what she saw looked like herself. She went downstairs, and her mother looked at her from across the parlor with an expression that was complicated and layered and contained, somewhere in the middle of it, something that might have been helpless admiration if the circumstances had been different. William Townsend said, "You look beautiful, Hester." She kissed her father on the cheek and picked up her wrap and went out into the warm April evening. The Cattlemen's Association Hall was the largest building on Main Street that wasn't a church, a two-story structure of well-cut timber that had been built 7 years earlier when the cattle trade in Caldwell was at its height, and money moved through the town like water through a floodplain. Tonight it was hung with oil lanterns along the front eave, and the windows glowed yellow, and the sound of a fiddle and a piano carried out into the street before Hester even reached the door. She went in on her own, which was unremarkable since she had walked to and from this hall all her life, and she found Clara Marsh near the refreshment table on the right side of the room. Clara was 24 and the wife of the town's deputy sheriff, and she was one of the few people in Caldwell who never tried to tell Hester what to do, which made her company extremely restful. "You wore it," Clara said, looking at the red dress with an expression of pure delight. "I wore it," Hester said. "Your mother is going to make this an extremely uncomfortable evening." She was going to make it uncomfortable regardless. At least now I'm comfortable. Clara laughed and pressed a cup of lemonade into her hand. And for a little while Hester was simply part of the evening, talking and watching and listening to the music, which was good music played by 3 men who knew what they were doing, and the hall filled up with the town of Caldwell in its social best. Dorian Hale arrived at 7:30, with the air of a man who was accustomed to being the most substantial person in any room. He was tall and fair-haired, as described, and he wore a good dark coat and clean boots, and he had the kind of deliberate ease about him that comes from money and the habit of command. He spoke to several men near the door, and then his pale eyes moved through the room in the systematic way of someone who has come with a specific purpose. His gaze found Hester across the room, and she watched him decide to cross to her. "Miss Townsend," he said, with a smile that was genuinely accomplished, "I don't believe we've been formally introduced, though I've heard a great deal about you." "Mr. Hale," she said, "I imagine most of what you've heard came from my mother." "A formidable woman," he said, and his smile didn't change, which suggested he was either very smooth or genuinely amused. "Shall I tell you what she said?" "I'd rather hear what you think for yourself," Hester said. He looked at her for a moment, and she felt him recalibrating slightly, which was interesting. Most men either flinched or stiffened when she spoke directly. Dorian Hale did neither. He considered. "I think," he said carefully, "that you are considerably more forthright than she suggested." "Is that a problem?" "On the contrary," he said, and this time the smile was different, more real, more careful too. "It's refreshing." She danced with him once, as she had told her mother she would, and he danced well, which was not a surprise, and he was perfectly pleasant in the course of it, asking her about the mercantile and about Caldwell's commerce, and about whether she had ever traveled east, which were the questions of a man who was reasonably intelligent, and had learned to keep conversation safely in the middle of the room rather than at the edges. She answered each one honestly and asked him nothing in return because she found she didn't particularly want to know his answers. When the dance ended, she thanked him and returned to the side of the room. It was in the pause between one set and the next that Seth Carver came through the main door of the Cattlemen's Hall. He had made something of an effort, she noticed, though the effort had the quality of a man who is making it to meet the occasion rather than to perform for it. He had a clean white shirt and a dark vest, and his hair had been combed, and the whole effect was of a man who was exactly who he was, tidied up. He stood near the entrance and looked around the room with the attentive ease of someone who is comfortable being in unfamiliar places, and his gray eyes moved through the crowd and found her. She did not look away. He crossed the room, moving through the various clusters of people with a natural kind of navigation that did not involve pushing or excusing, just the unhurried confidence of someone who trusted that space would be made, and space was made. He stopped in front of her. "Evening," he said. "You came," she said. "I said I might." "You didn't say that to me." "No," he said. "I said it to myself." He looked at her for a moment and then at the dress, and there was something in his expression that was not the appraisal she had been subjected to all evening, not the evaluating sweep of a man cataloging a woman's worth, but something more like recognition. "You made that," he said. She blinked. "How did you know?" "The fabric," he said simply. "I saw it in your hands on Wednesday." She felt something warm move through her chest, and she was not entirely sure what to do with it, so she kept her voice level. "You noticed that?" "I notice things," he said. "It's a good dress." "Thank you," she said, and she meant it with a fullness that surprised her a little. They stood there a moment in the way of people who are trying to decide whether to begin a conversation or merely let it be understood that a conversation has already begun. And then the fiddle started up again, and Seth held out his hand and said, "Would you like to dance, Miss Townsend?" And she said, "I would," and they did. He was not as polished a dancer as Dorian Hale. He had the honest dancing style of a man who had learned at ranch gatherings and trail camps, practical and rhythmic and genuinely connected to the music, and she found it enormously preferable to polish. They talked while they danced, which was the point of dancing if you were being honest about it, and she asked him things, real things, where he'd come from and where he was going, and what the land looked like between Texas and Colorado in the spring when the grass was just beginning to come up green over the brown of winter. He told her. He described it the way people describe the things they actually love, with specific details and a particular quality of attention that made her feel like she was seeing it herself. He told her about a stretch of country just north of the Red River, where the prairie opened so wide that you could ride all day and feel that you were the only person the world contained, and about the way August, his horse, had a habit of turning east in the morning to face the sunrise if you let him choose his own direction, and about a cook on his last drive, an elderly man from Georgia named Wallace, who made cornbread in a Dutch oven over a fire that was the single best thing Seth had ever eaten in his life. And he was laughing while he said it because Wallace had refused to share the recipe with anyone on grounds that it was the only thing keeping him employed. Hester was laughing too. She realized she had laughed more in the last 10 minutes than she had in the entire hour before he arrived. The set ended and they walked off the floor, and she got them both lemonade, and they stood near the window and talked for another hour. And she was aware, in a way she was not usually aware of time, that the evening was moving and she did not want it to. Across the room, Margaret Townsend watched this development with an expression that combined deep suspicion with the particular frustration of a woman whose carefully arranged plan is being dismantled by random circumstances. She spoke to Clara Marsh's husband, Deputy Jim Marsh, about the newcomer, and Jim told her that Seth Carver was a drover with no property who was passing through on his way back to Colorado, and Margaret's expression tightened considerably. Dorian Hale watched too, though his expression was harder to read. He watched Seth Carver talk to Hester Townsend, and he watched the way Hester looked at this drover who had no land and no house, and something moved behind his pale eyes that was either calculation or resignation or both. Hester was not watching either of them. She was fully in the conversation she was in, which was the best conversation she had had in as long as she could remember, and she was discovering, with a kind of delighted certainty that felt both new and completely inevitable, that Seth Carver was a man who had opinions and offered them directly and listened to hers with the concentrated quality of a person who actually wanted to know what she thought. She said something about the way the cattle trade was changing Caldwell's character, bringing in money and roughness in equal measure, and he took her point seriously and added to it and pushed back on one element of it, and she pushed back on his pushback, and they were, she realized, genuinely disagreeing about something, and it was exhilarating. "You don't just say what you think the other person wants to hear," he said, looking at her with the direct gray eyes. "Neither do you," she said. "No," he agreed. "I never learned how. My mother said it was a flaw." "What do you think?" He considered this. "I think it saves a lot of time," he said, "and time's not something you get back." She looked at him and felt the particular quality of this moment press itself into her like a stamp into wax, permanent and clear. The lantern light was warm and the music was good, and outside through the window the Kansas night had the particular stars of late April, bright and close. "Mr. Carver," she said, "are you really leaving in a few days?" "I've got a contract back in Colorado," he said, and his voice had something in it she couldn't quite name. "But I've got some flexibility on the timing." She looked at him steadily. He looked back. "Then perhaps," she said, "you should stay a few more days." He smiled then, not the accomplished practiced smile she had been receiving from men all evening, but a real one, a little lopsided, a little wondering, the smile of a man who was genuinely pleased by something. "Yes," he said, "perhaps I should." The evening ended late and walked home under the wide Kansas stars with a feeling in her chest like the first green shoot of something significant pushing up through hard ground. And she thought about the red dress, and about the way Seth Carver had looked at it not as something to appraise but as something to understand, and she thought that was the difference. That was the whole thing, right there, in that one look. She did not see him Sunday because it was Sunday and Caldwell observed it Sundays, but she thought about him with the steady frequency of a thought that has decided to take up residence and is not going anywhere. She helped her father in the mercantile in the morning and sat with her mother in the afternoon, and answered her mother's various pointed questions about the drover with careful honesty that satisfied no one. "He has no property," Margaret said. "That's true," Hester said. "He's a hired hand. He's a working man who's very good at what he does. And what does that get you? A life on the trail, following cattle from one territory to another." "I don't know what it gets me," Hester said, which was the most truthful answer she had. "I've known him 3 days, but I think he's worth knowing better." Margaret made the sound she made when she had run out of arguments and had not yet accepted defeat, a compressed exhalation that contained multitudes, and Hester returned to her mending. Monday morning Seth appeared at the mercantile at 8:30, which was early enough to catch her before the day's business got properly underway, and he bought a length of rope he almost certainly did not need and a small jar of boot polish. And while he was paying he asked her if she would walk with him, if she had the time and the inclination, and she looked at the morning and the clear sky and told him to come back at noon. He came back at noon. They walked south along the edge of town, where the houses thinned out and the land opened up, and the prairie began in its wide and particular way, the grass still short in spring, but already showing the green that would build into the great sea of it by summer. They walked far enough that the town behind them was a collection of roof lines and they could hear meadowlarks, and the wind came from the west the way the Kansas wind always comes, steady and clean. She asked him about his childhood, and he told her about his father's ranch in central Texas, a modest place that had been a good life until it wasn't, and about his mother, a woman named Rose Carver who had been raised in Virginia and had come west with her husband and had never, not for a single day, allowed the frontier to make her smaller than she was. He described her with the careful tenderness of someone who carries a loss and has learned to carry it honestly. "She sounds extraordinary," Hester said. "She was," he said. "She wore men's trousers when she worked in the barn, and nobody told her she couldn't because she'd made it very clear that her opinions on the matter were the only ones that counted. My father thought she hung the moon." Hester looked at him. "What happened to her?" "Fever, the summer of '76. My father sold the ranch 2 years later and went to live with my aunt in San Antonio." He paused. "He's there still, getting old and complaining about the heat, which is his right." She laughed softly. "And you've been driving cattle ever since?" "It's good work," he said. "Honest work. You're out under the sky all day and you know what you're doing and why you're doing it." He looked at her from the side. "I know it doesn't look like much from the outside." "I'm not looking at it from the outside," she said. He stopped walking and she stopped too, and they stood facing each other with the wind moving between them and the meadowlark still calling somewhere in the grass, and he looked at her with that clear gray gaze that felt like weather, like the particular clarity of air after a storm. "Miss Townsend," he said. "Hester, I want to be straight with you. "Please," she said. "I've got a contract that runs through October. A ranch in Pueblo County, Colorado needs a trail boss for the fall drive, and I've committed to it. I'm not a man who breaks commitments." He held her gaze. "But when October's done, I'm a free man, and I've been thinking since Saturday night that there might be a reason to stop being quite so much in motion." She felt the warmth of this move through her like April sunlight, slow and spreading. She did not say anything immediately, because this was not the kind of thing that required an immediate answer, and he knew that, which was one of the things she was learning about him. "I've been in this town my whole life," she said at last. "And it's been a good life, mostly. But sometimes it feels like the town is a dress that someone else picked out, and I've been wearing it without quite meaning to." He looked at her carefully. "And you'd like to pick your own?" "Yes," she said, "exactly that." "Then let's see if we can't figure out what that looks like," he said simply, and she thought that this was perhaps the most perfectly adequate thing anyone had ever said to her. They were back in town before 2 o'clock, which was respectable, and she returned to the mercantile, and he returned to doing whatever it was a man did with himself in a small town between obligations. And the afternoon passed, and the evening came, and she went to bed with something warm and complicated and lovely settled in her chest. He stayed 7 days instead of 3. In those 7 days she learned the following about Seth Carver. He read when he could get his hands on books, and he preferred history and natural science to fiction, though he had read 2 of the Walter Scott novels and found them engaging if overlong. He had no strong opinions about religion, but he believed genuinely in doing right by people and animals and the land, which she thought was the functional equivalent of faith. He could cook well enough to survive on the trail, and modestly better than that when given adequate equipment. He had a genuine and unaffected kindness toward ordinary people, the kind that expressed itself in small, consistent actions rather than grand gestures, and she watched this across those 7 days in the way he spoke to the stable boy at the livery, and the elderly Chinese laundress on Grant Street, who most of Caldwell treated as invisible, and in the patient way he negotiated with Griggs the cattle broker over a payment dispute she happened to witness on Thursday morning. He was also, she discovered on an evening walk along the creek south of town, funny. Not the performative funny of a man who wants an audience, but the quiet observational funny of someone who sees the small absurdities in things and reports them as though they are news. She laughed a great deal that week, and Clara Marsh told her she looked different, and when she asked different how, Clara said, "Like someone who's opened a window that's been stuck for a long time." On the 6th day he kissed her. They were sitting on the low bank of the creek as the sun went down, the water running quiet over stones, the cottonwood trees just beginning to leaf out, and she had said something. She could not afterward remember what, and he had turned to look at her with that clear gray gaze that always felt like it was seeing slightly past the surface, and then he had leaned forward and kissed her gently, the way a person does something they have wanted to do for several days and have been waiting for the right moment. And the right moment had simply arrived. She kissed him back, firmly and without hesitation, which he later told her was the most characteristically Hester response imaginable. They sat by the creek for another hour after that, talking and sometimes quiet, and the stars came out over Kansas one by one the way they always do, the sky darkening from deep blue to black at the edges and working inward, and she thought that she had been in a great many places in her life without ever going anywhere, and that she might be, finally, about to go somewhere. On the 7th day he said he had to leave, but that he would write, and that he would be back. "I don't want promises you can't keep," she told him. "That's the thing," he said. "I can keep this one." She believed him, and this belief was not the blind optimism of inexperience, but the considered judgment of a woman who had learned to trust her own assessments of people, and she believed him. He left on a Thursday morning in late April with August the bay horse and his saddlebags, and the particular straight-backed ease of a man who has somewhere to be and knows how to get there. And he turned once in the saddle and raised his hand, and she was standing on the boardwalk in front of the mercantile, and she raised hers in return. The weeks that followed had the quality of a life that was continuing its ordinary business while simultaneously waiting. She worked in the mercantile and sewed, and attended church and visited Clara, and endured her mother's periodic attempts to revive the subject of Dorian Hale, who had called on the house twice in May with a formal propriety that Hester handled by being consistently polite and consistently unencouraging, until he finally stopped coming, which she respected him for, actually, because he was perceptive enough to understand a clear signal when one was given. His first letter arrived in the 3rd week of May. It was 4 pages, written in a hand that was clear and not elegant but readable, and it described the country between Caldwell and Pueblo County in the way he described all landscapes, with the particular attention of someone who is genuinely interested in the world around him. It mentioned a hawk he had watched for 20 minutes from horseback one morning, and a conversation with a Comanche man he had met at a water crossing, who had known the country for 60 years, and spoke about the changes in the grass and the water with a grief that was very quiet and very deep. He wrote about August and about Wallace the cook, who had, apparently, agreed to join the fall drive out of Pueblo County, and he wrote about her, one paragraph near the end that was simple and direct and made her sit down on her bed and read it twice. She wrote back the same day, 4 pages of her own, and the correspondence began. Letters traveled the frontier with the Pony Express, and then the railroad mail service, depending on the year and the route, and by 1883, the service between Kansas and Colorado was reasonably reliable if not perfectly swift, and their letters crossed paths and arrived sometimes in clusters and sometimes after long silences, but they came. And in them, over the weeks of summer, they built something together, which she thought was not a bad way to build a thing, honestly and word by word with time to think between. Her mother, reading the fact of the letters if not their contents, moved through a sequence of reactions: disapproval, concern, resignation, and finally, in late July, a surprised and grudging softness that she would never have admitted to out loud but which expressed itself in her having a fresh pot of coffee ready whenever Hester came downstairs from writing her replies. William Townsend read one letter, the one that arrived in late June and was particularly long and contained a description of the Colorado landscape at sunrise that made Hester's breath catch, and he said simply, "He writes well for a drover," and handed it back, and Hester understood this to be her father's version of a blessing. Summer moved through Kansas in its heavy golden way, the heat building through June and July, and the thunderstorms coming in from the west with their dramatic light, and their particular smell of rain on dry grass. And Caldwell did its cattle town business, and the Townsend mercantile did its commerce, and Hester measured and stocked and sold and mended, and made 2 more dresses and a skirt from fabrics she chose herself. And she felt, in a way she had not felt before, like a person who knew where she was going. In late July, she made a decision she had been turning over since June. She went to her father in the back room of the mercantile on a quiet afternoon when her mother was out, and she told him that she wanted to learn the full accounting of the store, not just the day-to-day stock management but the books, the ordering, the business side of it, because she thought she would like, eventually, to have a business of her own. He looked at her for a long moment. "What kind of business?" he said. "Dressmaking," she said. "Alterations, custom work. There isn't a proper dressmaker in Caldwell. People order from catalogs in St. Louis or they make do. I could do better than that." "You could," he said, without hesitation. "I'd need to learn the accounting." "Sit down," he said, and pulled the ledger out from under the counter. She sat down and they spent the afternoon with the numbers, and she learned what she needed to know, and afterward she felt like a door she had not seen before had opened in the wall of her own life. She wrote to Seth about it that night, and he wrote back, 2 weeks later, with the concentrated enthusiasm of a man who is genuinely pleased by someone else's plan, and he said that he had been thinking. He hoped she wouldn't mind his saying so, that there was a small commercial block being built in Pueblo County's county seat, a town called La Junta, and that while Caldwell was her home, and he had no intention of asking her to leave it on his account, he thought she should know that opportunities existed in more places than the one place she'd always been, and that she should think about what she wanted, honestly and without reference to what he wanted, because he believed in her right to make that determination entirely for herself. She read this twice and then a third time, and something settled in her that had been gently turning for a long time. She realized, falling in love with Seth Carver. Not the way you fall into water, fast and helpless, but the way the season changes, gradually and then completely, until one day you look around and it is entirely different from what it was. September came with the first cool evenings and the prairie grass turning to gold and the light going amber in the afternoons, and Seth's letters told her about the fall drive preparations, and about the country drying out at the end of summer, and about a conversation he'd had with the ranch owner in Pueblo County, a man named Edward Thorne, who was apparently considering expansion, and had asked Seth if he'd be interested in a permanent foreman position when the contract concluded. He asked her what she thought, not what he should do, but what she thought. She wrote back a long letter about permanence and choices, and the fact that she had been making her own life here in Caldwell and would continue to make it wherever she was, and that the question of where was separate from the question of who, and that the who question she thought she could answer, if he was asking in the way she thought he was asking. He was asking in exactly that way. His reply arrived in early October, and it was direct and warm and made her laugh and made her eyes fill at the same time. And it said, among other things, that he was going to come to Caldwell when the drive was finished, and that he would like, if she would hear it, to say certain things to her in person that were better said in person than in letters. She wrote back that she would hear anything he had to say. He arrived on a Friday in late October, riding in on August just as the afternoon was turning toward evening, and the light was the best kind of October light, low and golden and generous, and she was on the boardwalk in front of the Mercantile because she had been watching for him, which she was not embarrassed about, and when she saw him coming down Main Street, she felt the particular completeness of a thing that has been anticipated fully arriving. He dismounted and tied August at the post and came up to the boardwalk and looked at her, and she looked at him, and 6 months of letters and all the things that build between people who are paying genuine attention were right there between them in the October afternoon. "Hester," he said. "Seth," she said. He took off his hat. "I'd like to ask you something." "Ask," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and this was not the quiet of uncertainty but the quiet of someone choosing his words with care. "I'm not a man with a great deal to offer in the conventional sense," he said. "I have some savings and a good reputation and work I know how to do. I have Edward Thorne's offer, which is a real offer. I have August, who is an excellent horse, and I have the firm intention of spending the rest of my life with you if you'll have me in whatever arrangement suits you best." She held his gaze. "Whatever arrangement suits me. You pick the place," he said. "You pick the work. You pick whatever you want to build and I'll help you build it. I mean that. It's not an accommodation, it's a preference. I'd rather live in your world than ask you to live in one you didn't choose." She thought of the pale blue dress with its high collar and its 12 ivory buttons like a spine of constraints. She thought of the red dress she had made with her own hands. She thought of her father's accounting ledger and Clara's laughter and the creek in April and the letters that had come across the plains all summer, honest and warm. "I want to stay in Caldwell," she said, "for now. My parents are here and the business makes sense here, but I want to open my own shop, dressmaking and alterations, and I want to be able to change my mind if I need to." "All right," he said. "And Seth," she said, and her voice was clear and steady and entirely her own, "I'd like to marry you." He looked at her and his smile was the real one, the lopsided one, the one that started in his eyes. "I was going to ask you that," he said. "I know," she said, "but I wanted to ask it first." He laughed. It was a full, genuine sound that carried out into the October street, and she thought she could spend her whole life causing that laugh and not regret a moment of it. He came into the Mercantile with her and met her parents, which had a quality of theater about it since William Townsend had been reading his letters all summer, but was performed with proper formality because that was what the occasion required. William shook his hand and was warm about it. Margaret Townsend looked at Seth Carver with the thorough assessment of a woman who has been disappointed by circumstances and is reconsidering her position, and she said, after a long moment, that she hoped he intended to settle properly. And he said that he did, and she said, well then, and went to put the kettle on, which was her version of welcome. They were married in December. It was a small wedding by the standards of Caldwell society, but a proper one, in the First Presbyterian Church on Cedar Street, which had a good wood stove that kept the interior warm against the December cold, and which smelled of pine boughs and candle wax. Clara Marsh stood up with Hester, and Jim Marsh stood up with Seth, which was appropriate since Jim was the closest thing Seth had to a friend in Caldwell by then, having spent a number of evenings at the Marsh house after Seth moved into the hotel permanently in November. Hester wore a dress she made herself. It was not red this time. It was a deep ivory with a nap to the fabric that caught the light, simple in its lines the way she preferred things, with the sleeves she liked, and the neckline that was not strangling, and a small row of pearl buttons at the cuff that had cost more than she intended, but looked exactly right. She had the red dress still and would wear it many times in the years ahead, but this was its own dress, made for its own day. Margaret Townsend sat in the front pew of the church and watched her daughter come down the aisle in a dress she had made with her own hands, marrying a man who had come into their lives by accident and stayed by intention. And she felt, she would tell Clara later, an emotion she did not have a name for exactly, something between the grief of a thing ending and the relief of a thing going right. Seth stood at the altar and watched Hester come down the aisle, and the look on his face was not complicated at all. It was the clear, unclouded look of a man who has exactly what he wants and knows it. The ceremony was brief, and the vows were the traditional ones, though Reverend Collins let them add a line each, which was not strictly standard, but he was a reasonable man. Seth said that he would respect her judgment in all things, and Hester said that she would tell him the truth always, even when it was inconvenient, and everyone present felt that these were more useful promises than the traditional ones, practically speaking. The reception was at the Townsend house, which had been opened up and filled with people and food, and it was warm and cheerful and exactly the right size. And William Townsend gave a toast that was short and honest, and said that he had always known his daughter would find her own way, and that he was glad she had found good company for the road. And Seth shook his hand again afterward and meant it. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, which was not romantic in the conventional sense, but was private and warm and suited them well enough. And in the morning they had breakfast at the hotel dining room and made plans. Seth took the foreman position at Thorne's Ranch in Pueblo County on a modified arrangement that allowed him to be based in Caldwell during the months between drives, which Thorne agreed to because Seth was worth accommodating. He would make 3 or 4 long trips a year, a month to 6 weeks each, and the rest of his time was in Caldwell. This was not the conventional arrangement for a ranch foreman, but it was the arrangement that suited them, and both Seth and Edward Thorne were pragmatic men who preferred what worked over what was conventional. In January, Hester rented the small storefront 2 doors down from her father's Mercantile on Main Street, which had been empty for 7 months since the previous occupant, a cobbler named Price, had moved to Wichita. She cleaned it herself, and Seth built shelves and a long cutting table and a fitting area screened by a curtain. And she ordered supplies from the same St. Louis catalog that had once been the source of the pale blue dress she refused to wear, and she opened her doors in the second week of February 1884. She called the shop Townsend Alterations, which her mother pointed out should properly be Carver Alterations now. And Hester said she had thought about that and had decided to keep Townsend because it was the name people in Caldwell knew, and because her identity was not erased by a marriage, which she intended no disrespect to Seth by. She mentioned this to Seth, who said that he understood perfectly and that his feelings were not injured, and that she should call it whatever she wanted to call it. And he meant it with such evident sincerity that she leaned up and kissed him in the middle of the cutting table, which was not something she had planned but which felt right. The shop was successful from the beginning, which did not surprise Hester, who had known there was a gap in Caldwell's commercial life, but which surprised some people who had thought it an uncertain venture for a woman without formal training. She had skill and she had taste, and she had the instinct for what would suit a particular person. That is the core of the work, the thing that cannot be learned from instruction. And she had her mother's energy, if not her mother's priorities, and within 3 months she had more work than she could handle alone. She hired a girl named Dorothea Reeves in the spring, 15 years old and quick-fingered and eager to learn, who would still be working with Hester 11 years later when the shop had expanded into the adjacent storefront, but that was ahead. Seth came home from his first Colorado trip in April, 2 days earlier than expected, riding into Caldwell on a warm afternoon with August looking trail dusty and his own face slightly lean from the weeks of camp cooking. And he came directly to the shop, and she turned from the fitting table where she was working with a customer, and she felt the full warm weight of married love, which was not the giddy uncertainty of those first months, but something more solid and more sustaining. The knowledge of the specific particular person who was at the center of your life, and the gladness of seeing him. After the customer left, she went to him properly, and they stood in the middle of the shop in the late afternoon light, and she held on to him for a long, quiet moment, her face against his shoulder, and he held her back with the uncomplicated rightness of two people who have learned how to fit together. "Were you cold?" she asked into his shoulder. "Some nights," he said, "but I brought you something." He produced from his coat pocket a small flat piece of Pueblo County turquoise, rough cut, and the particular blue-green of shallow water, which he had gotten from a Ute trader he'd met at a creek crossing on the way south. It was not polished. It was just the stone itself, raw and improbable in that extraordinary color. She held it in her palm and it caught the light. "It was in a handful of stones the man had," Seth said. "I saw it and I thought of your red dress." She looked up at him. "The red dress is red," she said. "This is blue." "I know," he said. "I thought of it anyway." She kept the stone on the windowsill of the shop for years, in the light where it could catch the afternoon sun. And whenever customers asked about it, she told them a man brought it back from Colorado because it reminded him of a dress, which was a nonsensical explanation that somehow made complete sense. Life in Caldwell in 1884 moved at the pace that frontier life moved, which was both slow in its dailiness and fast in its changes. The cattle trade was already beginning to shift as the open range gave way to barbed wire fencing, and the great trail drives that had been the town's lifeblood started to diminish. And Caldwell adapted the way towns do, finding new commerce and new purposes, and losing some of its rawness and some of its color simultaneously. There were more families now, more churches, more children in the school, and fewer of the pure Wild West qualities that had made it both dangerous and alive. Hester thought about this sometimes, about what was being lost and what was being built, and she talked about it with Seth when he was home, and he had the perspective of a man who had seen a great deal of the frontier over the years, and he said that the wildness was not disappearing exactly, it was moving. Going further west and further north, ahead of the settlement the way it always had, and you could follow it or you could stay and build, and both were legitimate ways to be. They were building. In the summer of 1884, Hester discovered she was pregnant. She told Seth on a Sunday morning in June, standing in the kitchen of the house they were renting on Elm Street, and his reaction was one of those moments she would return to for the rest of her life. The way he went very still for just a moment and then pulled her in close and said, against her hair, "A baby," in a voice that was quiet and full of something she recognized as wonder. "A baby," she confirmed. He drew back and looked at her face. "Are you well? Are you happy?" "I'm very well," she said. "And yes, I'm happy." He was gone on a drive in August when the pregnancy was at its most uncomfortable, which was one of the genuine difficulties of their arrangement. But Clara Marsh was there and her mother was there, and Margaret Townsend, who had spent the better part of a year recalibrating her feelings about this marriage, turned out to be extraordinarily useful in a practical crisis, which was something Hester had always known and was now deeply grateful for. Seth came back in October and she was enormous and uncomfortable, and he came through the door with his trail dust, and she was sitting in the armchair in the parlor with her feet up, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked at him, and they were, both of them, a little overwhelmed in the best possible way. The baby was born in November 1884 on a Tuesday, after a labor that was long and difficult and managed by the town's midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Holt, and by Dr. Emmett Graves, who had been practicing in Caldwell for 6 years and was the kind of doctor who came when you called and stayed until he was sure. Seth was in the house and was told to stay in the parlor, which he did mostly, though Mrs. Holt had to redirect him from the doorway 3 times. It was a boy. They named him William James Carver, William for Hester's father and James for Seth's father, whose name was James Bernard Carver, and he was dark-haired from the beginning in a way that suggested he would look like his father, and he had his mother's direct and evaluating quality of attention even as an infant, which amused everyone who noticed it. William Townsend, the grandfather, sat with the baby in his arms the afternoon after the birth, and was entirely undone, which was a sight Hester would treasure always. This quiet and steady man whose reserve was genuine and absolute, holding his grandson and looking at him with a love that needed none of the words he had never been very good with. Seth held his son that first evening, and was very still with him and very careful, with the particular tenderness of a large and capable man handling something he knows is precious beyond any other calculation. Hester watched them from the bed where she was resting and felt something so complete move through her that it almost hurt, the way very strong light sometimes does. "He's looking at me," Seth said. "He does that," she said. "He's been doing it for 3 hours. He has your eyes," Seth said. "He has your hair." "Poor boy," Seth said, and she laughed and felt the laugh pull at her tired body, and she laughed anyway. The year that followed was the fullest of her life, which was saying something. The shop grew, young William grew. Seth was home more than the previous year because Thorne had restructured the ranch schedule and needed Seth for planning work through the winter months. And Caldwell was changing, and so were they, growing into the particular shape of their married life with all its particulars. Seth built things. When he was home and not working for Thorne, he built things, because he was physically incapable of sitting still when there was work that needed doing. He expanded the shop's cutting table. He built a crib, then a proper bed when William outgrew the crib. He fenced the back garden. He helped 2 neighbors with their own repairs in the simple, unasked way of a man who sees a need and has the means and the inclination to address it. He had not entirely laid aside his life on the trail. He did not want to, and she did not want him to on his behalf, because it was part of who he was, the part that needed the open sky and the long distance and the work of moving large animals across great country. He went to Colorado twice in 1885 and once in 1886, and each time he came home the particular quality of his return made her understand that separation was not only a hardship but a gift, that it kept them from the dulling that happens when 2 people lose the ability to see each other freshly. He brought her things from the road. Not expensive things, they were not wealthy people, but particular things. A piece of red sandstone from a canyon in New Mexico. A book he had found at a trading post in the Colorado Territory. a natural history of the Great Plains grasses, which he knew she would find interesting, and she did. A handful of turquoise beads from a Navajo trader on the Santa Fe route that she strung on a piece of leather cord and wore around her wrist. In 1886, the year William Carver was turning 2, a harder thing happened. A fire started in the tack room of the livery stable 2 blocks from their house in the early hours of a March morning and spread quickly in the wind. And by the time the bucket brigades were formed, 3 buildings were involved. Hester's shop was not directly adjacent to the fire's path, but it was close enough that there was a genuine threat. And Seth and Half, the men of Caldwell, spent 3 hours in the cold dark fighting the spread of it, while Hester stood at the edge of the activity with William on her hip and watched her neighbors work and kept a clear head about where the wind was and what it meant. The fire was contained. The livery and 1 adjacent commercial building were destroyed, but the fire line held 2 buildings short of the shop, and when the morning came gray and smelling of smoke, her shop was intact. The livery owner, a man named Bert Sayers, lost everything. He was 50 years old and had built the stable over 20 years, and it was gone in 3 hours. Hester knew Bert and his wife Martha, and she organized, in the days following the fire, a collection among the businesses and households of Main Street, going door to door with a straightforward ask that was simply, "Bert Sayers needs help, and I am collecting it." And she raised enough to give the Sayers family 6 months of operational expenses and a meaningful start on rebuilding. Seth worked with Jim Marsh and 3 other men to help clear the burned site and lay the first new timber, which took the better part of 2 weekends, and Bert Sayers shook hands with Seth afterward with the particular quiet of a man who has received more help than he expected and does not have the words for what it means. Life accumulated around them in the way that life does when it is going right, not without difficulty, but with the underlying quality of something that is genuinely working. Their neighbor on the east side, a widow named Mrs. Pauline Cross, fell ill in the winter of 1886, and they brought her meals and kept her wood stacked and her water carried, and she recovered in the spring and left them a jar of her preserved peaches on the doorstep with a note that said simply, "Thank you, both of you." Clara Marsh had her first child in 1886, a girl she named Lucy, and she and Hester sat on Clara's porch in the warm evenings of that summer with the babies and talked about what they thought and what they hoped and what they found to be true about the lives they had built, with the particular freedom of women who trust each other absolutely. "Did you know?" Clara asked once. "When you met him, did you know right away?" "Not exactly," Hester said. "I knew he was different from what I'd been expecting. I knew he saw me clearly. The rest took a little longer." "The dress," Clara said. Hester looked at her. "What about it?" "When you walked into the social in that red dress you'd made yourself," Clara said. "That was when I knew, watching his face." Hester was quiet a moment. "What did his face do?" Clara smiled. "He looked at you like the room had changed temperature," she said. Hester thought about this. She thought about the pale blue dress still hanging behind her parents' bedroom door, never worn, a catalog order from St. Louis that had arrived in brown paper and been the occasion of one of her mother's great campaigns. She thought about the red fabric at the bottom of the crate and the 11 days of sewing, and the way the light looked in the cattlemen's hall that April evening and the clear gray eyes of a man she had not yet known. "I'm glad I made it," she said. "I know you are," Clara said. "So is he." In the fall of 1887, Hester found out she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first in terms of the physical experience, though she was busier now and had Dorothea Reeves to lean on in the shop when she needed to be off her feet, which Dorothea managed with the quietly capable air she brought to everything. Seth was in Colorado for the fall drive and came back in late October to find Hester 4 months along and in good health and extremely opinionated about what to do with the second bedroom upstairs, which she had decided to repurpose from storage into a proper nursery. "It can be both for a while," Seth said, looking at the boxes stacked along one wall. "It can be a nursery," Hester said. "The boxes can go to the barn." The boxes went to the barn. She had a daughter in February 1888. The labor was faster this time, and Mrs. Holt was there again, and Seth, by now experienced at the protocol of staying in the parlor, managed it with slightly more equanimity than the first time, though Mrs. Holt still redirected him once. They named her Rose Margaret Carver. Rose for Seth's mother, Margaret as a gesture to Hester's mother, who received the news of the name with a complicated silence that resolved itself, over the course of about 10 seconds, into outright crying, which was the most unguarded Hester had ever seen her mother be, and she held her mother's hand at the kitchen table while Margaret composed herself and said thickly that it was a beautiful name, and Hester said yes, she thought so too. Rose was different from William from the beginning, in every way that two children raised in the same house can be different from each other. William was quiet and observing, already showing at 3 years old the steady, attentive quality his mother had and some of his grandfather's careful steadiness. Rose was loud and joyful from her first weeks, a baby who laughed early and often, and who regarded the world with something between delight and outrage, depending on whether her immediate needs were being met. Seth, who had not grown up around young children, turned out to be a natural father in the way that seemed paradoxical until you knew him well, because the same qualities that made him good on the trail, the patience, the attentiveness, the comfort with long periods of quiet followed by decisive action, all of these things translated directly into fatherhood. He was not demonstrative in the excessive way, but he was consistent and present and warm, and both his children knew, in the bone-deep way that children know things, that he was entirely on their side. Hester watched him with the children in the evenings when the shop was closed and the day was over, and they were all in the small, warm, domestic space of their house on Elm Street, and she felt the particular quality of a life that had been built on honest choices, the kind of satisfaction that is deeper and quieter than happiness and more durable. She had picked her own dress in every sense of the phrase, and the life it had led her to was more entirely hers than anything that had been arranged for her could ever have been. Margaret Townsend, who had spent the better part of 2 years recovering from the disappointment of her plans for Dorian Hale, had by 1888 arrived at something close to genuine approval of Seth Carver, which she expressed in the oblique way characteristic of her by never saying it directly, but by making him a large breakfast whenever he came to the house after a return from Colorado, and by asking his opinion on commercial matters, with the respect she reserved for people whose judgment she trusted. Seth accepted this without comment and was consistently respectful toward her, and gradually, a genuine warmth developed between them that neither of them would have predicted. William Townsend and Seth simply liked each other, which had been true almost from the beginning and deepened over the years into the quiet, satisfying friendship of two men who respect each other's competence and do not require much conversation to sustain a good relationship. Dorian Hale, in the way of life that is neither a story's villain nor its hero, remarried in 1886, a woman from Wichita named Clara Whitmore who seemed, from what Hester heard through Caldwell's social channels, to be genuinely well-suited to him. She heard this with simple goodwill. Whatever she had thought of him that spring, she had never thought him a bad man, and she was glad he had found what suited him. 1889 came with news that the territory of Oklahoma was to be opened for settlement in the spring, which sent a wave of anticipation through Caldwell, since the town sat right at the southern border of Kansas, and had long looked south with the particular hunger of a frontier community that knows the next frontier lies just ahead. Men talked about the land runs in the saloon and on the boardwalks and at the association hall, and some of them went, the ones who were still oriented toward the further edge of things. Seth talked about it with Hester one evening in February, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, with the oil lamp between them and the winter wind doing its work outside the walls. "You're thinking about it," she said. "I'm thinking about it," he agreed. "Not for the land run. I'm not a homesteader by nature." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "But the opening of that country changes the cattle routes. It changes what Thorne's operation needs. He wants to talk to me about it." "Are you going to go see him?" "I'd like to in March, if that's manageable." She thought about the shop and Dorothea and the children and the general question of March, which was not the busiest month. "Go," she said. He looked at her. "I won't make any decision without talking to you first." "I know," she said. "Go see what he has to say and then we'll talk." He went in March and came back in April with the outline of a proposal from Edward Thorne that was interesting and substantial. Thorne wanted to expand his operation southward into the new territory, and he wanted Seth to manage the expansion, which would mean more months in the field and a larger operation and a significant increase in their income, but which would also mean more time away. They spent 3 evenings on it. Hester laid out her thinking the way she always laid out her thinking, direct and complete, and without the omission of the parts that were difficult. She said she was not opposed to the expanded role, but that she needed honest accounting of the time away, and that the children were young enough that his presence mattered in a way it would matter differently in 5 years, and that she was not asking him to give up the work, but to tell her truly whether the extra responsibility was what he actually wanted or whether he was considering it partly for the income. He said he was considering it for both reasons and that the income was not negligible since they were not wealthy and 2 children, and a house were not inexpensive, and she said fair. And he said that his honest feeling was that the expansion work was genuinely interesting and that he'd been doing the same drive pattern long enough that he was ready for something that used more of what he knew. She thought about this for a day. "Do it," she said on the 3rd evening. "But I want one condition." "What's the condition?" "When the children are school age and things are more settled, we talk again about La Junta." He looked at her with the clear gray eyes. "Colorado, you mentioned it once. Years ago that there were opportunities. I've been thinking about it longer than you might think." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd leave Caldwell, not forever," she said, "and not yet, but I'd like to know the option is there." "The option is always there," he said. "It was always your decision." "Our decision," she corrected. He smiled. "Our decision," he agreed. He signed the expanded contract with Thorne in April 1889 and spent more of that year in the field than any previous year. But he arranged it in 4 defined periods rather than the open-ended way he had previously worked, which meant Hester could plan around them, and the planning helped. She was better at managing the shop alone now, and Dorothea Reeves had grown into a genuinely skilled seamstress by this point, and young William was 5 years old and increasingly self-possessed, and Rose was 1.5 and in constant cheerful motion. The years between 1889 and 1893 had the particular quality of the middle period of a good life, full and ordinary and punctuated by the things that punctuate. A child's first day of school, a family illness managed, a good summer followed by a difficult winter, a moment of particular happiness that stands out in the memory like a stone in a field. William started school in 1890 and took to it with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, and Rose started in 1892 and took to it differently but just as thoroughly, coming home on her first day and reporting at the dinner table that she had made 2 friends and learned the alphabet, and that her teacher, a Miss Bowen, was very smart and wore interesting hats. Seth had been home for Rose's first day of school, which was not planned but was a gift of timing, and he had walked her to the schoolhouse door with William on one side and Rose on the other, and he had come back to the shop afterward and come through the door, and she had looked at him, and his face had the particular expression of a man who has just experienced something significant and is not yet certain how to hold it. "She walked right in," he said. "She's Rose," Hester said. She didn't even look back. "She knew we were there," Hester said. "She didn't need to look back." He stood there a moment and then he laughed, the full real laugh she loved. And she crossed the shop and put her arms around him, and he put his around her, and they stood there in the middle of the cutting table and the bolts of fabric and the good useful life of the shop, And it was an ordinary moment that was also, in the way such moments are, everything. The fall of 1893 brought a conversation that had been building for 4 years. Thorne's Colorado operation had expanded significantly, and the center of it had shifted to a base near La Junta, and Thorne wanted Seth to be based there rather than managing from the trail. It was a real promotion and a real change, and Seth brought it home on a Thursday evening and they talked about it as they always talked, at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. William was 9 now, Rose was 5. They were old enough for a change and young enough to adapt. I talked to Dorothea, Hester said. He looked up. When? Last week, when I started thinking you might be coming to me with something like this. She looked at him steadily. She wants to buy the shop. He was quiet. She has the money. Her father died 2 years ago and left her a modest inheritance. She's been running most of the daily operation for 3 years. She knows the work and she knows the customers and she loves it. Hester folded her hands on the table. I could set her up properly and sell it to her at fair value, and she would take care of it the way I'd want it taken care of. And you, he said. La Junta is a town that's growing, she said. I've been writing to the county commercial registry. There isn't a dressmaker there of any quality. She looked at him with the full direct honesty that was simply who she was. I've been waiting for the right moment for 4 years, Seth. I think this is it. He looked at her for a long time, and in his face was the particular expression that she had first seen on a Saturday evening in the cattlemen's hall, the look of a man who is genuinely seeing the person in front of him and is permanently moved by what he sees. You've already decided, he said. I wanted to tell you, she said. Not ask you. I wanted to tell you and hear what you think. I think, he said slowly, that you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I have been saying that to myself since April of 1883, and it just keeps being truer. She felt the warmth of this in a way that was completely different from that first warmth in the cattlemen's hall a decade ago, deeper and more settled and more sure, the warmth of being known by someone over a long time and being seen and being loved not despite your particularity, but because of it. Is that a yes? She said. It is absolutely a yes, he said. They moved to La Junta in the spring of 1894, the year Hester was 34 and Seth was 39, packing the house on Elm Street into a wagon and loading August, and a younger horse Seth had added to his string, a gray mare named December, and the children's things, and the contents of the shop that were hers to take, and the turquoise stone from the windowsill, which she wrapped carefully and packed in the center of a crate, because it was not something she would leave behind. The goodbye to her parents was the hardest part. William Townsend was 61 by then and in reasonable health, but showing the slowing that comes to men of his steady, moderate constitution, and he held Hester for a long time at the door of the house on the morning they left and said nothing because he never had the words, but she felt the whole of what he meant, and she said, against his shoulder, "You come and visit, both of you. The train runs through La Junta directly." "We will," he said. And they did, twice a year until his death in 1901, and in between there were letters that arrived in both directions, with the faithfulness of a correspondence that had the frequency of love behind it. Margaret Townsend stood at the gate and watched the wagon go and held herself very straight and did not cry until Hester was out of sight, and then she cried for a good 20 minutes, according to what William told Hester afterward. And then she composed herself and went back inside and wrote Hester a letter that arrived in La Junta 3 weeks after they did, 4 pages of her mother's angular handwriting, and the 4th page said things Margaret Townsend had never said directly in her life, including that she knew she had sometimes pushed too hard and that Hester had been right to push back, and that the life she had built was more than anything her mother had tried to arrange for her, and that she was proud. Hester sat at the kitchen table of their new house in La Junta on a Colorado morning in May and read this letter and cried in the open, uncomplicated way of someone releasing something that has been held for a long time. And Seth came in from outside, and she handed him the letter and he read it standing in the doorway, and then he sat down across from her and said, quietly, "Good." "Yes," she said, wiping her eyes. "Good." La Junta was a different kind of western town from Caldwell, a railroad junction town in the Arkansas River Valley, with the Rockies visible on a clear day to the west, and the Spanish influence of southern Colorado in its architecture and its people, more mixed and more complex than Caldwell's prairie plainness. Hester loved it immediately, and with the particular intensity of someone who has been waiting for the thing they are feeling without knowing exactly what it was. She opened the shop in June 1894, in a two-room space on 3rd Street, a block from the main commercial district, and she called it Carver's, which was her name and Seth's and felt right in a way that Townsend alterations in Caldwell had felt right, but different, further along, more arrived. She painted the sign herself, in good black paint, and it hung above the door in the Colorado sunlight, and she stood back and looked at it and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing she had made that was entirely hers. Seth's work with Thorne's expanded operation kept him in La Junta, or the surrounding county, for most of the year now, with drives in the spring and fall, and the arrangement that they had built over 11 years of marriage had a kind of ease to it that was not sameness but was the particular fluency of people who know each other very well and have learned each other's rhythms. He still brought her things from the trail. A flat river stone from the Arkansas River, smooth and dark, which she set on the shop windowsill next to the Colorado turquoise. A copy of a scientific journal about the soil composition of the Great Plains that he had found in Pueblo, which she read through twice and found genuinely fascinating. Once memorably, a small painting done in oil on a scrap of board, bought from an itinerant artist outside a trading post, showing the Colorado country in autumn, the aspens turned gold against the dark of the pines, which she hung in the parlor and which Seth said, when she asked, had reminded him of the color of her very first red dress, and she thought this was perhaps the most romantic thing anyone had said to her in 11 years of marriage, and she told him so. He looked pleased by this in the unself-conscious way he was pleased when something genuinely landed, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had married a man who was fundamentally good, not in a simple or uncomplicated way, but in the deep structural way that is either a person's nature or isn't, and his was. William and Rose thrived in La Junta with the adaptability of children who have been raised in a house where their parents' choices are visible and honest. William attended the school on 2nd Street and showed an aptitude for mathematics that was starting to look, by his 9th year of life and his first in La Junta, like it might take him somewhere structured, engineering perhaps, or commerce, the kind of precise applied thinking that needed more formal education than the frontier West offered. Hester began, quietly, to write to the academy in Denver about what was possible, and Seth had opinions about this that were supportive and practical, and she appreciated both qualities. Rose attended school and had strong opinions about everything, which was simply who she was, and she was beginning to take an interest in the shop in the way that had nothing to do with any expectation Hester placed on her, but simply the pull of a child toward the thing her parent does with genuine love. She would come to the shop after school and sit in the corner doing her reading while Hester worked, and sometimes she would ask questions, not just about sewing but about the choices. Why this fabric and not that one? Why a particular line suited one woman and not another? The aesthetic reasoning behind the work that was actually harder to teach than the technical skill. Hester answered every question fully and without condescension, and Rose listened with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely learning. In 1896, Hester turned 36 and Seth turned 41, and the world had changed enough that the trail driving that had defined his working life was genuinely diminishing, not gone, but changed, as the open range closed and the railroads changed the calculus of moving cattle across the country. Seth talked to Thorne about the future, and Thorne was honest with him about what he saw coming, and there was a long conversation over 2 evenings in March of 1896 about what the next phase looked like. Seth came home from the second evening and told Hester that Thorne had offered him a position managing the ranch's land operations from a fixed base, no more trail work, purely the management and planning side. It was a different kind of work. It was also practically the shape of what the cattle business was becoming. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to take it," he said. "I'm 41. I'm still good on the trail, but I'm not 28, and I want to be here more." She looked at him. "You want to be home?" "I want to be home," he said simply. She reached across the kitchen table and put her hand over his. "Then come home," she said. He took the position and he came home, and the particular shape of their days changed again, this time into the shape that would hold for the next many years. Him at the Thorne Operations La Junta offices most days and home in the evenings. Her in the shop through the day and home by the time the children came from school. It was ordinary and it was good and it was theirs. On a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1897, when William was 13 and Rose was 9, and the aspens outside of town were turning the gold of the painting in their parlor, Hester found the red dress at the back of the wardrobe where she had been keeping it for 14 years. It was carefully folded, the deep red of autumn leaves still in good condition because she had taken care of it, and she shook it out and held it up, and it was still unmistakably itself. A little dated in its line now, fashions having moved in the intervening decade and more, but the color was the same and the fabric was the same, and the particular quality of it, the thing she had seen in the cloth before she cut it, the dress that looked like her, was still entirely present. She put it on. It fit, more or less, the hips a little different after 2 children, but the seams had been cut with enough ease that it was still wearable, and she stood before the mirror in the bedroom and looked at herself and thought about April 1883, and a woman of 23 who had refused a pale blue dress with a high collar and cut red cloth with her own hands instead. She was 37 now. She had a shop on 3rd Street and 2 children, and a husband who had once told her she could wear whatever she liked, and had meant it in a way that turned out to encompass everything. Not just clothing, but choices and work and direction, and the whole shape of a life. She had a turquoise stone on her windowsill and a river stone beside it and a painting of golden aspens on her parlor wall. She had a mother who had told her, 4 pages into a letter, things she had never said aloud. She had a father she still wrote to twice a month. She had built a life that looked like herself. That was the whole thing right there. Seth came up the stairs with 2 cups of coffee and stopped in the bedroom doorway and saw her in the red dress, and his expression moved through surprise into something that was quieter and deeper, the look of a man who is seeing the full circle of something and understanding its shape. "I haven't worn it in years," she said. "Still suits you," he said. "Does it?" "Better than ever," he said, and she knew he meant more than the dress. He crossed the room and gave her one of the cups and stood beside her facing the small mirror, both of them reflected in it, and she thought they looked like what they were, 2 people who had made an honest choice a long time ago and had spent 14 years discovering what that choice contained. "Seth," she said. "Hester," he said. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her in the mirror. "For what specifically?" "For meaning it," she said. "When you said I could wear whatever I liked, for actually meaning it all the way through." He was quiet for a moment, and then he put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder, and they stood there in the autumn afternoon light coming through the window of their Colorado bedroom, with the coffee going warm in their hands and the sound of their children somewhere in the house below. And she felt the full weight of her life and found it, completely and without reservation, good. The years continued after that, as years do when they are going well, layering themselves into a life that was not without difficulty but was solidly, fundamentally right. William went to the Denver Academy for Engineering Studies in 1899 at 15, which was the right moment for it, and wrote home every week with a regularity that was characteristic of him, and which made both his parents feel, reading his precise and affectionate letters, that the boy they had raised had turned out well in ways that mattered. Rose stayed in La Junta through school, and then began working seriously in the shop alongside Hester when she was 16. And it became clear over the following years that she had not only her mother's skill but something distinctive of her own, an instinct for color and proportion that Hester recognized as a talent and treated accordingly, teaching her everything she knew, and then getting out of the way to let Rose find her own approach. Hester's father, William Townsend, died in the winter of 1901 at 69, quietly and without prolonged suffering, which was how he would have chosen it if choosing were possible. Hester and Seth and the children took the train to Caldwell for the funeral, and she stood at her father's grave in the Caldwell cemetery with the Kansas wind, doing what the Kansas wind always does, and she felt the depth of her love for this man who had handed her his accounting ledger one afternoon and said, without preamble or fanfare, "Sit down." She took her mother home with them to La Junta for 2 months afterward, and Margaret Townsend spent those 2 months in the guest room of the house on 3rd Street and in the shop on days when she wanted company, and something eased between them in those 2 months that was the final easing of the last remaining constraints of mother and daughter, leaving only the simpler and more spacious relationship of 2 women who know each other. Margaret returned to Caldwell in the spring of 1902 and lived there in the house she and William Townsend had shared for 43 years until her own death in 1907, at 72, clear-minded to the end, and by the account of her neighbors and the letters she wrote to Hester, genuinely at peace. Seth managed Thorne's La Junta operations through the early years of the new century, watching the West change in the ways it was always changing, the cattle economy restructuring, the railroads pulling the country into something new, the frontier in all its original wildness receding further into memory and history. He was good at adapting because he had always been good at adapting, and he found the new shape of the work as satisfying as the old shape in different ways. He was 50 years old in 1905, and he had the leanness of a man who has spent his life outdoors and the particular quality of ease of a man who has nothing to prove to anyone. And Hester, who was 45 and had a successful shop and a daughter, who was becoming an excellent dressmaker in her own right, and a son who was sending home letters from engineering projects across the territory, looked at this man across the kitchen table of the house they had been in for 11 years and felt the full amplitude of everything they had built. "I want to tell you something," she said one morning over breakfast. He looked up from the newspaper, which was the La Junta Tribune, which reported local news with the earnest attention of a paper that knows its community depends on it. "Tell me," he said. "I am very happy," she said, not in a simple way, in the specific way of someone who got to choose their own life and chose well. He set down the paper and looked at her with the clear gray eyes that still held the same quality she had seen in them on that first evening in the cattlemen's hall, the quality of actual seeing. "So am I," he said. "Exactly that." She reached across the table and he took her hand, and they sat there in the Colorado morning with the coffee and the newspaper, and the light coming through the kitchen window at the angle it came in autumn. And the house was quiet around them in the particular quiet of a home that has had children in it and has still not lost the warmth of that. And outside the aspens along the river would be turning gold again in the weeks ahead, as they did every autumn, as reliable as the seasons and as beautiful. And the red dress was folded in the wardrobe upstairs, and the turquoise stone sat on the shop windowsill, catching the afternoon light the way it had for 11 years. And everything that had been built honestly and with 2 pairs of hands, and there was nothing in any of it that had not been chosen. William James Carver came home from Denver in the spring of 1906 with a young woman named Alice on his arm, a composed and quietly funny civil engineer's daughter from Boulder who had opinions she did not trouble to conceal, and who shook Seth's hand with the firmness of someone who had been raised to mean it, and who looked at the shop on 3rd Street with the particular attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what a person has made, and who said to Hester, after 5 minutes in the shop, that she thought the layout was extraordinarily efficient for the space, and Hester liked her immediately and completely. Rose Carver, 22 years old in 1910 and running half the shop's operations alongside her mother, met a young man named Emmett Dale, a cartographer who had come to La Junta on a surveying project for the Federal Land Office, and who had the quality of a person who finds the precise mapping of the world's edges genuinely fascinating, and who looked at Rose with the focused attention of someone whose professional instinct to see clearly had extended to this particular woman and was not going anywhere. They were married in 1911 in La Junta, and Rose wore a dress she had designed herself, deep blue with ivory trim, and she was radiant and entirely herself, which was the only way Rose Carver had ever been anything. At the wedding, Hester sat beside Seth in the front row of the church and watched their daughter come down the aisle in her own made dress, and she felt the circle of it, the full round completeness of a thing that begins in one place and arrives, years later, in the same place but changed, deepened, made new by the passage through time. Seth found her hand in his during the ceremony, which was something he always did, and she held it, which was something she always did back, and the church was full of the warm light of a May afternoon and the good sound of the organ, and the people they knew and loved gathered in the particular configuration of a celebration. And outside, the Colorado mountains were there on the horizon the way they always were, the Rockies, permanent and improbable. And the town of La Junta was everything she had thought it might be when she was 23 and cutting red cloth on a table in her father's mercantile. Not this town specifically. She had not known this town, but something like it, a place she had found herself by her own road, living a life she had built with her own hands. The morning after Rose's wedding, Hester woke early as she always did and went down to the kitchen and made coffee, and Seth came down a few minutes later, and they sat in their usual chairs in the usual morning quiet. And the house was full of the residue of the celebration, flowers and the good smell of a party that had gone well. And through the kitchen window, the Colorado dawn was beginning in the east over the flat land, and the sky was turning the particular pale gold of early spring morning. "Good wedding," Seth said. "Very good wedding," she said. "Rose looked like you," he said. She looked at him. She looked like herself. "Yes," he said, "which is what I meant." She smiled at him across the coffee cups and the morning table and the 28 years of a life that had started with a refusal and had become, from that refusal, everything she had ever wanted and everything she had never known to want until it was already hers. She was 49 years old. He was 54. The aspens were not yet gold, it was spring, but they would be gold in the autumn as they were every autumn, as they would always be. As the sun came in the kitchen window in its seasonal angles, and the mountains held their ground on the horizon, and the turquoise stone on the shop windowsill caught the afternoon light the way it had always caught the afternoon light, and the red dress was in the wardrobe upstairs, folded with care, exactly as she had left it. She had made it herself. She had worn it herself. And every single choice that followed had been hers. That was, she thought, more than enough. It was everything.